So there's something about creativity that is much deeper. We think of it as the highest order process. That's actually not the way to think about it. We have to think about it as a really fundamental drive that begins with our instinct to explore the world that we have as newborns, to make sense of and explore.
From Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City, this is Your Brain with Dr. Phil Stieg. Internationally renowned scientist and researcher, Dr. Stieg is Neurosurgeon-in-Chief of New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. This week, Dr. Stieg and his guest explore making sense of creativity.
Our guest today is Dr. Anna Abraham, a neuroscientist and renowned expert on one of the most fascinating aspects of the human brain, creativity and imagination. We are here to discuss her most recent book, The Creative Brain, Myths and Truths. She'll answer some of the most perplexing questions about the creative mind. Do our brains work differently when creating a poem or painting compared to solving a math problem? What is the relationship between being creative and being intelligent? Why are some people more creative than others, and can we actually improve our own creativity? Anna, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So when you think of creativity, the word creativity, what does that mean to you, and what should the listeners be focusing on?
For me, it reflects perhaps the pursuit that we all do, which is to come up with novel or surprising ideas that are in some way satisfying. It might be because it satisfies the needs of a particular problem. It might be because I'm just trying at something and I can see myself getting a little bit better. So the satisfying element, I think, covers all sorts of reasons of why we create in different domains. But it's really about coming up with ideas and solutions that are novel or surprising, that have some end.
And it's not limited to just the creative arts. It's creativity in all aspects of life.
Absolutely not. Creativity is everywhere. It just because there's more degrees of freedom in the arts. That's why the ubiquitous association is there.
Could you tell us what are the 2 or 3 main characteristics of a creative individual?
From what we know, in terms of internal characteristics, creative people across the sciences and arts tend to be people who are very curious and open to experience. They're highly intrinsically motivated, which means they gain a lot of pleasure from doing the creative activity from itself. It's not like they're doing it for an external reward of some sort. And the third thing is probably that they're very dogged, they're determined, and they're not averse to risk-taking.
Since the creative brain is about myths and truths of creativity, what are the, say, top 3 myths about creativity?
The most widely held myth is that the right hemisphere of the brain is the seat of creativity and not the left hemisphere. Top held myth number 2 is that creativity is strongly tied in some way to mental illness. And number 3 would be a new one that's all the rage, which is that psychedelic drugs improve creativity.
Are there metrics to measure creativity so that we can balance our instinctual feeling with some metric that says, aha, this is the way it is?
Yes, there are metrics, but they're all very limited. But the more cognitive type of approach that I've been following is trying to understand the processes that we use when we're trying to come up with a new idea. How do we use our minds differently when we read a poem compared to when we recite a poem from memory, compared to when we devise and write a poem? That's a very different way of looking at things.
One of the last chapters in your book is the default mode network. What is that in our brain in terms of creativity?
Well, the default mode network has fascinated me for a long time. And it is the network for all of the operations that involve certain aspects of the imagination. The default mode network refers to a cluster of brain regions that are active when we are at rest or when we're not really focused on a particular task. Actually, it can even be active when you're doing something that requires a lot of focus. So there's a lot of studies on driving. And when you look at how often people drift away and start to daydream. They're doing that 70% of the time when they drive. And we know this from our own experience. Sometimes you're driving and think, how do we get here? I don't even know what happened. So it's a really, if you think about it, quite a complicated task, focusing on the road. There's so much you have to pay attention to. But after years and years of experience, it becomes such an automatic thing. Your brain almost has cues that it uses to know when to switch from being almost a conscious, focused mode to being a relatively defocused mode. When it's in this defocused mode of not particularly being on some sort of goal-directed, very obvious task, it tends to drift away. And it's the same areas that occur when you're just taking a break. And that's why they call the default mode networks.
It's kind of the part of the brain that's active when you're imagining, when you're sitting around and going through imaginations, yes?
Well, yes, but certain types of imagining. To say that the default mode is the imagination network, for instance, is over-prescribing.
Oversimplifying it.
It's actually oversimplifying the case, exactly. A lot of the work actually shows us that multiple brain networks are very dynamically working together to come up with a creative response. And if you really just think about it almost like a thought experiment, it makes a lot of sense. Each of these networks are specialized in specific ways. So if you're talking about the cognitive control or central executive network, you'd use those for goal-directed activities, like stopping and going. The salience network is there to almost code for what is significant in the environment around you or coming up from within you. It's coding for salience. That's a different network. And when you're trying to come up with something new and meaningful or satisfying to you, which is what creativity is, all of these networks are involved in really dynamic ways. That makes it really hard to study because one study will show these two networks involved, another study might show another couple of networks involved. And actually, even if both of us use the same task, we might approach it differently. I might have some terrible visual imagery, and then my secondary visual cortex aren't going to be as active as yours. You might have an excellent imagery. We're doing the same task. Behaviorally, if you look at it, it may not be very differentiated from each other, but actually we've used our minds differently. And that reflects the way in which all of our networks are working together when we're trying to come up with something new, because it requires going against the known, going beyond the path of least resistance. So then you're like sort of co-opting all of the machinery you have to try and come up with something that's different from what's out there.
You write a chapter about creativity and madness. It made me think of the movie Amadeus. Is there a link between madness and creativity, or are they two separate channels and they can crosstalk with each other?
There is a link, but that's not enough for us to make any conclusions because we don't know much about the why and the how. So the problem with the link is that there seems to be a kind of link. It matters what kind of condition you're talking about, first of all, and even the kind of artistic professions you might be talking about. But the main thing there is that even if there is a link, we don't know the directionality of the link. So we don't know if something about being an artistic practice is causing mental illness or something about having a form of mental illness is giving you some sort of positive bias towards the arts. Now, obviously, there's no case to be made for an all or none effect because it's not like all artists have some form of mental insufficiencies or that everyone who is suffering from some form of mental disorder is a renowned, creative, eminent person. It's absolutely not the case. So the question is, how much do they overlap? What is it exactly? And there's just wonderfully interesting considerations to think about. All it can tell you is that there is a link.
So you wouldn't say that there is a type of psychological difference, like Van Gogh seeing colors in a different way, versus another person like Steve Jobs, who was extremely creative in computer and AI and all that. Are there different types of psychological profiles that fit into the different kinds of creative world? Mathematics, engineering, arts, music, things like that.
It's a great question. There's so few studies that have actually compared.
So I can't pick my madness.
Yeah, you can't pick your madness, the artistic or the scientific. But there are certainly certain artistic groups, if you look at them, they are more vulnerable. Writers are the most vulnerable. And again, if you just think about why, it makes perfect sense. They do almost everything in isolation. They have to write by themselves. It's a much more long-drawn process. The reception of the work is not immediate. Somebody else has to open a book and read it, the whole thing. And it's a much sort of temporally drawn-out process. So it matters what kind of approach are you taking? What is the kind of product that you're coming up with? What is the value in that? So there's a lot of effort that goes into it and very little control over the outcome of how it's received, And so this is something that puts them at risk. The job itself puts them at risk in particular ways.
How has the iPad, the cell phone, and all that, is there any data on how that has affected creativity?
I don't think there's any data yet that has looked at it in any sort of really systematic and interesting manner. But if I think about young kids on TikTok and so on, they enter into it as a space where they can express themselves. In the case of creativity, we have to think about how things start. So let's say I am not a sculptor and I'm going to start today to sculpt actively. 2-3 times a week, I'm going to develop my practice. Before the age of phones, for instance, I didn't have to prove to anybody what I was doing to myself with my time or anything. It's just a private sort of practice that I did. A lot of focus now in younger people is that if you don't show it, it doesn't exist. It doesn't work. It's not even just younger people. It's even older people, even people my age group, right? If it's not out there on the internet, it didn't really happen. You have to have some sort of, let's say, footprint out there. And then people comment on it. And depending on how confident you are, you have a lot of people who can be unnecessarily cruel and so on. And it might stunt your willingness to engage much further, So that's one danger. The other danger is you could be actually really good at what you do. But it began from a place of intrinsic motivation, drive that gave you personal joy. And then you put it out there and then it becomes a joy about getting recognition. For a substantial number of people, they know that they want to create things that will generate that external frame. Of course, some people are able to wed their internal and external perfectly well, but for most part, what happens is the sort of homogenization of taste, which is you just do things that everyone will like. So then you flip into this world of the not particularly creative, the more it's about being popular or engaging or, all of those things, and less about standing out in a way that points out that, oh my gosh, there's some originality here. There's something novel here.
Researchers have been drawn to many aspects of the creative process. Longtime listeners of This Is Your Brain may remember this episode from Season 2, where we asked Dr. Ori Amir the eternal question, what's so funny?
So you're fundamentally looking at a person's process of writing a joke? Is that what you're looking at?
Yes, sir. So I looked into professional comedians, their brain activation during the process of coming up with a funny idea.
So what parts of the brain are activated when a comedian is creating a joke?
The short answer is pretty much everything. But there are areas where the unique things that have to do with writing jokes happen. So in our experiment, what we did was we shoved those comedians into this tube, the MRI machine.
So this is an MRI machine. Man, who knew it was going to be so cramped? Cramped and really noisy. Oh, this would be a bad time to learn I'm claustrophobic.
So basically they're lying there and they're looking through some mirror where a New Yorker cartoons are being displayed. And they basically have to come up with captions in 15 seconds to those cartoons.
Okay, what do we got? Psychiatrist office, and there's an elephant on the couch. Geez, doc, I wish I could forget sometimes. No. Elephant. How about, I'm in the middle of the room, and nobody will acknowledge that I'm here. Yeah.
So this is the task.
Are your subjects willing? Is this a happy time for them to work with you?
It beats the alternative, some of the other experiments they could have done.
Looking for more laughs? You can find a link to the complete comedy episode from Season 2 on our website, thisisyourbrain.com.
So let's flip over to psychedelic drugs. There's a lot of talk about how it enhances your creativity, enhances your insight. What are your thoughts?
I think it really depends on the individual, because when we take such drugs, the impact of these drugs is very varied. You and I can take something today and we will have a very different response to it. There will be aspects of our experience that are similar, but many aspects of it that are dissimilar. In terms of the way we make sense of the world and so on, we have the same machinery, but we have very different worldviews. The way we see things is very different. And so any sort of drug that is going to get in there to distort your perception of your reality, your meaning making, is therefore going to have quite an individual effect on how you use that information, how it can influence you later. In fact, there's great studies of artists on drugs trying to draw and stuff, and it's hilarious what comes out of there, right? And the moment of that, the experience, you're not actually interested in doing anything because it's this profound, perceptual, meaningful experience. But it can, if it changes the way you see the world or you engage with the world, it can have an indirect effect on your creativity. But this is individual.
But the specific thing I think I picked up from your book is the individual who has an openness to the possibility that the drug will have a positive effect versus a control freak, who won't respond as positively. That's true?
I'm glad you said that, because there's not really any studies that assess people's openness in real time. So openness to experiences is a singular personality trait that is strongly predictive of creativity, creative potential, creative achievement across age groups, from the youngest to the oldest person. And of course, open people are open to experience, including taking psychedelic drugs, right? You sort of sign in for these experiments, which means you're actually open. So what you need to factor out is, if there are improvements, how much of this improvement can be attributed to the drug taking versus the openness versus an interaction between the two. And really, there's not really been a study to do that, which is so surprising. But that's
your next study. You got to do that.
Yeah, get me some
get a grant
psychedelics.
Money.
Yeah, exactly.
With all the conversation about artificial intelligence, are we learning anything about creativity by studying AI or in making AI creative? Because it has to be creative in terms of the large language models and being able to beat us now in chess regularly. So,
yeah. Well, I look at AI as an alien, really. So there are things that it can do really well, way better than us. And I don't argue against the possibility of AI being creative. I think it's clear in a few instances that it has been. At the moment, there's so much hype about it all being creative. If you take the definition of creativity, what is called a standard definition, that is the production of responses that are novel and effective, then you can't deny it. It's there. Not all of what we see is, absolutely not, but there are enough indications. But what's important is it doesn't do things like we do.
So there's no way with current science that we're going to learn about our creativity by creating a creative computer.
No, because it's a different our machinery, if you want to talk about our bodies as machinery, is fundamentally different. And the analogy I like to give is that of like a cup of hot water. Let's say we want a cup of hot water, and we look at it and we think of an AI system made that cup of hot water, and Anna Abraham made this cup of hot water. But perhaps if I'm a hunter-gatherer, I had to rub sticks together and create a container that would heat that water and all of that. That's what my mind did. Whereas the AI is more like a kettle. It's been designed to do that. Just because the outcome looks similar, it doesn't mean the process is similar. The process is completely different. It has absolutely no relation to each other. And so this is a conflation of process and product that we constantly do. And again, because we're storytellers, because we're story listeners, we look at that and we reflect backwards. We assume the same intentionality, the same agency, and we are mesmerized by AI at the moment. There's good reason to be. It is spectacular what achievements there are, but it's an error to think of it as, just because we use the word intelligence or imagination, sometimes you have artificial consciousness, it doesn't mean it's the same thing. It's very, very different.
So it's a myth in development. Tell me a little bit about the creative mind in terms of slowing down the aging process, maintaining plasticity and maintaining memory. Is it important?
I think so, yes.
What's the evidence for that?
There's so much evidence to show us that creativity is both really fundamental to our brain and psychological makeup, and can be used to keep us on our toes, so to speak, as we age. The evidence comes from very differing pockets. Let's say music and music making. So the use of, let's say, melodic intonation therapy to treat certain forms of aphasia, which is a disruption of language production, right? So speech therapy doesn't work in those cases because their speech networks are broken. But because the speech networks and music networks partially overlap, you can facilitate some degree of function in that broken network using music therapy, okay? So the rehabilitative part is protective, is enhancing. That speaks to one aspect of it. The second aspect is to look at artists who develop some form of neurological disorders. It's clear that even if artists suffer from different forms of disorders, barring something seriously going wrong with their capacity to get out of bed, move at all, they continue to create. Their styles might change, their productivity might reduce, but they create. So something about creativity that is much deeper. We think of it as the highest order process. That's actually not the way to think about it. We have to think about it as a really fundamental drive that begins with our instinct to explore the world that we have as newborns, to make sense of and explore. That's where it begins. It's not something that maps onto something bigger. It uses everything we develop in order to strengthen itself and grow and become what it is, but it starts from this capacity that we have, which is to explore. And so it's very hard to break. It's very hard to break. That's one thing. And secondly, especially the artists who are the least vulnerable are usually the ones who have a lot of practice. If you look at musicians, they're the least vulnerable. And that's because of the amount of training they have to do on a daily basis to just keep up, maintain their level, really strengthens their networks. And because music is so multimodal, it impacts the auditory system, the visual system, the tactile system, the semantic system, the emotional, everything. It is very protective because of that. It influences everything. It's not just one little thing. And the fourth line of evidence is if you look at aging and its impact on creativity. Now, most things go, sadly, into cognitive decline. We're slower, certain aspects of our memory function start to decline, and so on. Creativity, though, is really resilient. There's not enough evidence at all to suggest that we decline. It looks like it can be maintained. Some of my own work has shown that older participants, if you're looking at practical creative problem solving, they're way better than younger adults in coming up with lots of uses and highly original uses. My next step is to sort of think, you know what they did with music therapy and aphasia? Could we make a bigger argument for using creative tools to rehabilitate memory functions? Because we tend to see a lot of work on creativity and well-being supporting that in the art therapy world or music therapy world. All sorts of practices stabilize all aspects of well-being, physical, intellectual, and emotional well-being, across populations, clinical or unclinical.
So based on that answer, I think it's safe for me to assume that you believe that all of us can be creative. But creativity, as you said, comes with hard work and practice. Is that correct?
Yes, we are all creative, and it is a practice. The best work on this that I've seen is Twyla Tharp's The Creative Habit. Everyone looks at people who achieved eminent things. And you mentioned Steve Jobs, Mozart, all these people. And even Mozart, like the amount of practice and exposure and training and just diligence a person has to put in to get to those levels. We just don't see that. So it's not part of the story that we tell ourselves. We don't see them struggle.
So is there any link between the creative spirit and the diligence or perseverance of the creative person?
You would be amazed that there's almost no work on that, right? Because we have these ideas about geniuses who have like God whispering to them through in their ears. And there are certainly people who are very talented and take immediately to specific kind of tasks, no question. But they have to work on their craft. And what really sets them apart is this perseverance side, this incredible drive and interest in what they do. And you can see this really well in the case of much older people as well. So Grandma Moses is a great example. She started to paint at the age of 78 and became an acclaimed artist in her own right. Showed at I don't know how many American museums and so on. 78. And before that, she didn't really do anything in the arts. She did a lot of embroidery. The reason she turned to the arts was because she wasn't able to embroider anymore because of arthritic conditions and so on. And my gosh, look what she made of herself. We don't like that story as much because there's something about creativity. We want it to seem incredibly magical. There's something about creativity because it looks immensely impressive as it is. What we want is an impressive, magical story to go with it. And this is just completely untenable.
I'm glad I have something to look forward to in my life. Drawing upon the quote from Thomas Edison that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, I presume you would agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think they're so intertwined. Genius, I think, partly has to do with what you're drawn to and what you can do, what you're capable of. And the other thing is just the level of investment you're able to put in is enormous. And that part of genius doesn't get talked about, which is the perspiration bit.
Dr. Anna Abraham, thank you for spending this time with us and reviewing your book, The Creative Brain, Myths and Truths. I've learned that we all have it. It takes perseverance, but most importantly, it's achievable for every one of us and makes us feel good about ourselves and makes people happy to be around us. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been delightful.
This is Your Brain with Dr. Phil Steig is produced for the Weill Cornell Medicine Department of Neurosurgery by the Really Interesting Picture Company. The episode producers are Hildy Rubin and Liz Witham. Social media management by Jillian Jean Creative. The series is directed and edited by Tom Veltri with music by Lenny Williams. The announcer is Mindy Weisberger. For more information, visit our website at thisisyourbrain.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. And be sure to follow Dr. Steig on Facebook at This Is Your Brain.